Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the February 2025 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we're pleased to have Melissa Griffin from the South Carolina State Climatology Office, who will be talking about CoCoRaHS and the value of citizen science observers. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. All right, let's get started with an overview of the climate. All right, so over the past month, we see that temperatures have been above average across the southern half of the region, especially across Florida and southern portions of Alabama and Georgia. In fact, many locations in this region are on track to record one of their warmest Februarys on record. Temperatures have been closer to average across the northern half of the region. In fact, we have a few spots they're running a bit below average over the past month. Across the Caribbean, above average temperatures continue to persist, especially in Puerto Rico, where San Juan is on track to record one of its warmest Februarys on record. Okay, next slide. So we often say the precipitation in the southeast is feast or famine, though when we say that, we're often referring to the warmer months of the year. But here we see a true feast or famine pattern across the region over the past month. In fact, several locations across the northern tier of the region are on track to record one of their wettest Februarys on record, while several locations across the southern tier are on track to record one of their driest Februarys on record. Across the Caribbean, there we see that precipitation has been mostly average, though there are some spots that are running a bit wetter and also a bit drier than expected. Okay, next slide. So perhaps the biggest story across the region this season has been the multiple rounds of winter weather, especially in places that don't see it very often. That was the case again this past month as another round of winter precipitation struck the northern half of the region, from Tennessee all the way to eastern portions of North Carolina and Virginia between the 18th and 20th of the month. Most locations, including a few across northern Alabama and Georgia, recorded 1 to 5 inches of snow. Some of the higher elevations of North Carolina saw up to half a foot. The heaviest snow, though, was observed across southeastern portions of Virginia, where several locations around Norfolk and Virginia Beach recorded over 10 inches of snow, making it the biggest snow event there since December of 2010. The heavy snow also extended south into North Carolina, where Elizabeth City recorded its highest two-day total in nearly 45 years, with 8 inches of snow on the 19th and 20th. Okay, next slide. So turning our attention to the drought monitor, we've seen a mix of improvements and degradations across the region over the past month. Conditions improved across much of Virginia and central portions of Tennessee and North Carolina, with some places actually seeing up to a 2-category improvement. Conditions also improved across parts of Alabama and northern Florida. On the other hand, though, areas of moderate drought and abnormal dryness expanded across parts of Georgia and South Carolina, as well as parts of South Florida, where pockets of severe drought recently emerged. And though, again, not shown here, the U.S. Caribbean continues to be free of drought or abnormal dryness. And of course, that's good news here as we continue to move our way through the heart of their dry season. Okay, next slide. So, in addition to winter weather, we also had some severe weather this past month, which unfortunately resulted in multiple deaths and injuries. On February the 6th, 2 people were injured from tornadoes that tracked across Putnam and Overton counties in eastern Tennessee, while an EF2 tornado killed 2 people and injured 2 others a little further east in Morgan County. That's not too far from Knoxville. A larger severe weather outbreak took place a little over a week later, stretching all the way from Louisiana to Virginia. multiple tornadoes were reported in Alabama and Georgia, some of which resulted in casualties. And while not shown here, there was also an EF3 tornado near Pensacola that injured 3 people back on February 11th. So far this month, there have been at least 15 confirmed tornadoes across the southeast, and that's very close to the monthly average. Okay, next slide. So as we saw last month, La Nina conditions have arrived, but the latest forecast, though, from the Climate Prediction Center gives about a 2/3 chance that we'll see a switch back to ENSO neutral conditions probably sometime this spring. As we've discussed, this is expected to be a weak event. And in fact, there's a 2 in 5 chance that the event may end actually just within the next couple months. And that's actually seen in some of the dynamical models there shown on the right side of the slide there. Okay, next slide. So even though we are looking at a weak La Nina, the seasonal projections from the CPC show sort of the expected pattern of above average temperatures across the southeast with below average precipitation across Florida, southern portions of Alabama and Georgia, and then above average precipitation across the interior of the region. That also includes northern Alabama and much of Tennessee. Okay, next slide. Looking across the Caribbean, the seasonal outlooks continue to advertise above average temperatures and generally above average precipitation across the region over the next few months. Okay, next slide. And the seasonal drought outlook closely mirrors these projections, with drought persisting and expanding across the southern and eastern portions of the southeast, with improvements expected across the interior of the region, while the U.S. Caribbean is expected to remain free of drought over the next several months. Okay, next slide. All right, so some of the short-term projections here as we look to this weekend and into next week, we see generally a warm and wet pattern, actually not just for the southeast, but for much of the country. And if we go to the next slide and look out to later next week and into next weekend, we see a continuation of above average temperatures and above average precipitation. And if we go to the next slide, so taking us here into mid-March, it's looking like above average temperatures will persist across most of the region, except across the Carolinas and Virginia, with wetter than normal conditions just about everywhere, except across the southern tier. All right, next slide. Okay, there you go. There's the summary for you to look over after the webinar. Also want to acknowledge our service climatologist, William Schmitz, for all his hard work in putting this information together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd for our water resources update.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started, and we can move from my intro slide actually into the 28-day stream flow slide. And so with that, all the rain we've seen in the last month has improved things some. So we can see that on the left-hand side, a lot of the stream gauges as a 28-day average are showing near normal, some a little bit above normal, and as we get into the more coastal areas, we get to a little bit below normal. We've had enough rain at the tops of the basins that a lot of the longer basins that run all the way to the coast have seen pretty normal stream flows in those areas. It's those areas that have that are closer to the coast or that haven't had as much rainfall up in the mountains that have impacted those. And so we do see a little bit of dryness as we get into the coastal plains and kind of in that area. And even in Florida, while we've been we'll talk about this when we get very specifically to the Florida, while we've been dry and we're getting into a drought, this is their dry season. And so that's the reason that a lot of those gauges across Florida you see as normal, even though we do have some below normal around the Tampa area and so forth. But because it's that time of year where it's dry, it's kind of supposed to be drier this time of year anyway. So that's kind of the reason you're seeing that. So let's look specific. Let's go to the next slide and start talking about each of the different states. and what that means. And so we'll start from the western portion of our area, and you'll see a pattern as we go through most of these that in Alabama's perfect example, we were really starting to get into a drought as we were into January, and you can see the fluctuations of what the normals are for this time of year. We're not usually this low this time of year. If we had this much stream flow in these streams during September and October, we would be above normal. But this is the time of the year where we're supposed to be recharging. This is the time of the year we're supposed to be potentially having floods. And we did get some floods last week. We did see some flooding, which is what we would expect during this time of year. So Alabama is a good example of that. They jumped up pretty good in the last week or so, a lot of those stream flows, and you can see those improvements there. Same for Georgia. We were starting to get into the lower zones and in the below normal stream flow, and we have jumped up. Now it's not very much into the normal, but we are in that normal. As for Florida, you can see we are just treading just barely above the below normal. We're in the normal range, but just barely above normal. And part of that's, we did have a wet fall in some places with hurricanes and everything else. So there's some residual, but you can see how wet we were during the hurricane season and how quickly it's dried out. You can see, how wet we were, and then by December and January, we had dropped a whole lot. We have had some rain, enough rain during the winter that we have seen some improvements, and they've just, like I said, barely stayed above that. So let's go ahead and start moving north and east. And the next one we'll start talk about is South Carolina. And South Carolina, again, while not seeing the improvement we've seen, I think, in a couple of the other states, has seen some improvement. And so things are looking a little bit better there, but they could obviously still use some rain during the month so that we're not talking about drought as we get into the spring. As for North Carolina, that bounced back also and bounced back by a good bit as they had some snow, they had colder temperatures, so stream flows have stayed pretty high. I know the reservoirs in North Carolina are trying to get rid of some water so that they can handle any rainfall that's coming. A lot of the core reservoirs are working to try and move some water so that they'll be able to handle any rainfalls we get in March to keep us from flooding. So there's a lot of that work going on also. And then we get into Virginia, and while we only cover the Southeast RFC only covers the southern part of Virginia, you can see the significant improvement across that whole area. And part of it's because they've had significant snow, they've been cold, there hasn't been any evaporation out of the area, so they've gone up very, very quickly. So with that, let's look at the next slide, and it's going to show what our current conditions are across the Southeast. And while we did have some flooding last week, you can see that a lot of that water has moved from the Atlanta, Birmingham area, and North Georgia, and the coastal, and South Carolina North. It's kind of moved to the coast, and so you see a few action stages in those areas and a few flood stages. So we have had that water move down towards the coast, and it was while we had some flooding, I believe we had one or two moderate floods, but most of it has been normal type flooding for this year. So let's go to the climatology on the next slide and talk about what's normal for this time of year and what that should look like. And what you can see here, we're in week 9 of the year, and we're getting very close to the peak of where we should be for this is the flood climatology, but we always talk about this as being the flood and recharge season because it's part of our climatology, and it's very important for keeping water resources in good shape once we come out of the winter and springtime and go into summer. And so it's important. Obviously we don't want flooding. That's not what we're looking for. However, that's part of what we can expect, and we do need that water to be there. And so this is the time of year over this end of February through early April is probably the most impactful time and probably the most important time in most of the Southeast, because our next slide is going to go to Florida, which has a very different feel. We talk about this regularly, and you can see that week 9 is we have a little bit of flooding during that time in some years, and most of those are El Nino years. And we are in a La Niña year, and it has been very classic La Niña because we have been very dry down there. And so we haven't seen any flooding since the hurricane season. And so, but that will change as we start to push forward and move forward in time, and we start to get to the wet season. Once we get to the May timeframe and things start to flip, the switch starts to flip and we start to see rainfall in those areas. So it's something we'll have to watch, and the timing of when that wet season starts will become very important. So let's go on to the next slide, and it's kind of our expectation of what we expect for the Southeast. We're expecting normal risk for river flooding. Last month I had some below normal both in the Carolinas and over in Alabama, but now it looks like for the spring, because we have had enough rainfall to see improvements and to see a little bit of flooding. And as Chris mentioned, March is leaning towards a wet month, and a wet month will tend to, in March, will tend to give us some flooding. And so that's the reason we're looking at normal type flooding, normal risk for flooding. So we should expect some floods during that time, and we'll be watching that and warning for that. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which is my summary slide. And then with that, I will let you all know you can go ahead and go to the next slide because you'll be able to look at this later. This will be my last webinar with you guys. I will be finishing out my career here at the end of the week, but you are in good hands. Shelby Saxon is sitting in here with me, and will be taking over and doing all of the work and doing a lot of these seminars with the rest of our staff. We should be adding some more staff to some of that work, and so you'll be hearing from them. And so thank you for everything. I've enjoyed doing these with all of you for the last 15 years, from the ACF portion where it was just the ACF, and then going across the Southeast, and it's been a great experience. So thank you all. And with that, I will pass you off to Pam, who will talk about ag.
Well, good morning, everybody. And Todd, thank you so much for all your service to us, and we wish you the best. I'm sure you're going to be going on to do great things that aren't necessarily in the flood field or the drought field. But we're happy to have had you here for as long as we have, and welcome, Shelby. I'm going to go ahead and start on agricultural impact. So if we go ahead and look at the first regular slide, that will list some of the recent conditions that I've seen with agriculture. Certainly not all of them. It's not a real active part of the season yet, but there are things growing. And so some of the impacts that I saw when I was looking through press releases and newspaper articles and so on. First of all, the snowstorm that we had in late January really caused a lot of problems for nurseries along the path of the snowstorm. And you might remember that was more in South Alabama, South Georgia, and then on up the East Coast. A lot of these nurseries, they have a lot of plants growing, and they put shade structures up to protect the plants from too much sun. Those shade structures are engineered to survive hurricanes, but they're not really engineered to survive pounds and pounds of snow. So they lost a lot of these shade structures. You can see a picture there in the bottom left. And of course, the crop that was underneath them. And so really for them, it was worse than a hurricane. And so they're in the process of trying to work up relief for those farmers. A lot of the farmers are not necessarily actively planting yet, so they're still trying to figure out what to plant, the variety or the crop, and they're preparing their equipment. Some of them are also out working in the fields as well to get the fields ready. This year is a little better than last year because it's drier, so people are able to get into the fields a little bit more than they were last year, where there was a delay because everything was so wet. Strawberries have been coming out of dormancy in many places. There's various ways that they can do irrigation or row covers to protect them. I was driving home from a talk through Watkinsville, Georgia, and saw the Washington farms using overhead irrigation on their strawberries. I wish I'd gotten a picture of it, but by the time I realized what it was, I was already way past it. And so that's something that people are using. The people that are growing strawberries in coastal South Carolina and so on are really having to watch that carefully because a lot of the strawberries are close to being ready to pick. Some high bush blueberries are starting to bloom now too in the warmer parts of the region. And so frost protection is really being used a lot. for that, the recent cold spell. I've had several calls about that, and I'm talking to the blueberry growers later this week on a Zoom meeting to talk about, problems with the freeze that we're seeing. We have noticed that some of the plants that are out are experiencing fungal diseases like white mold, and so farmers are having to watch for that. And Florida has been quite dry, as Chris pointed out, and so they're having to use increased irrigation to keep their plants alive. Of course, they're not really too worried about frost once you get down into the peninsula ways, but that is something that is always a concern because there's a lot of demand for that groundwater, and so that's something to watch for. On the next slide, we're going to go ahead and look at the recent soil temperature and soil moisture conditions. And so there we go. Soil temperature is showing, and this is the soil temperature for just the top layer of soil. So it doesn't go very far down. Of course, the farther down you go in the soil, the less it responds to the daily variation in temperature conditions. These were grabbed this past weekend, so there have been a few changes since then, but um, there should be links on there that you can go and look at the most recent maps. You can see the southeast, with the exception of Virginia and parts of North Carolina, have been quite a bit warmer than usual. And so I've been getting calls, is it time to plant? Is it time to plant? It's probably a little too early. We'll talk about the frost in just a minute. Soil moisture, you can see the northern part of the region has been quite wet because they've been in the path of more of these storms recently, whereas a lot of the other region has been fairly dry, especially eastern North Carolina. They've had a lot of problems with drought, and it's been expanding there. And Florida, of course, has also been dry. There is a little band there in southern Georgia, which I think is probably related to remains of all that snow that we've had. If we go on to the next slide, we're going to see the chill hour accumulations, which I like to show this time of year. And the chill hour accumulations I always use are for Peach County, Georgia, which is it's sort of in the center of the state in the big commercial peach band. And I put in the inset there what I showed last month. Last month we're getting chill hour accumulation at a very rapid rate because January was so cold. But if you look at the more recent curve, the red there is this year's curve for the chill hour accumulation. It flattened out at the end of January and into early February because it was so warm. We were basically getting no chill hours at all. It has cooled off a bit, so we're starting to accumulate more. But it looks like now we're probably not going to accumulate as many as the historical average, although I think we will be above last year. And most people that I've talked to have told me the chill hours are fine now. The plants are ready to go. And so that is something that we'll be watching in the next couple weeks. If we look at the next map shows the coldest temperatures that we've had in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And in that map, it shows, and I grabbed this one on the 19th or 20th over the weekend because I've got 3 talks this week. I looked this morning, and the cold temperatures have actually gotten farther to the south because of the frost that we had on Friday morning and in some places Saturday morning as well. And so this is a little outdated. You can get an updated map at the link there in the bottom. But we're still in a period where we're getting frost across almost all the region except for the Florida Peninsula. And so I think it's probably a little too early to really start planting yet, but it's something we're going to be watching very closely. And especially because, we had that warm spell, and there are some blueberries blooming as well as the strawberries, which are really coming along well. So the next slide shows the frost map for the region as well as the first bloom index. And you can see there the 50% risk of a freeze is shown in the top right there. And we are in the bright green band right now for the average. So that is the last average date of the last freeze. Really stretches from southeastern Alabama through southern Georgia and covers some of the really pretty much all of the Florida panhandle as well. And so half the frosts occur after this date. So it's probably a little too early to be planting unless you think that they're going to be able to withstand those cold temperatures. I looked ahead at the forecast. There was some indication that there could be some colder temperatures around March 7, but those long predictions change a lot, so that's something to keep in mind. I usually tend to look at forecasts from tropicaltidbits.com, I did put that on here. I'll do that next month. But anyway, that is a place that I use to kind of look at what the likelihood of temperature changes is and precipitation and so on. That, as I said, does have a tendency to change over time, especially if you get more than a week out. So the next slide shows the soil temperatures for Georgia, which is, these are from the network that I manage for the University of Georgia. And you can see this is the 4-inch soil temperature. We also measure at 2 and 8 inches. The temperatures below are generally colder, but you can see that we are now reaching the threshold of 50 degrees, which is the threshold I think many people use in Georgia for planting corn, as long as you know it's going to stay 50 or above. So if you're not going to plant corn when it's 50 degrees if the forecast is for you to get back to freezing conditions. So it's important to watch the temperatures over several days. I'm sure in Florida they're probably already planting sweet corn, and even in southeastern Georgia there may be a few people that are doing that as well. Although the recent cold spells have maybe caused them to wait a little bit, and so we'll see on that. Other crops depend on different temperatures, like peanuts really need soil temperatures of about 65, and so it'll be a while before those get planted. Usually corn is one of the first commodity crops that goes into the ground. And so that is the last of my regular slides. My summary is on the next slide, and I will thank you for listening. And if you've got any comments, I did not put any agricultural impacts from the snow that hit Virginia and eastern North Carolina. There probably were some, but I didn't see any. So if you have any information about that, you're welcome to put that in the chat or email me about that later. That'd be great. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Griffin, who's going to talk about CoCoRaHS. And I have to tell you that Melissa is just a dynamo when it comes to recruiting new observers. And I'm a state coordinator for Georgia, and she just blows me out of the water because she has done such a good job. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this talk and getting some pointers about what I should be doing better. So take it away, Melissa.
Thank you for that introduction, Pam. I really do appreciate it. Also, thank you for the opportunity to speak this month during this webinar about a project that you can tell Pam is passionate about, but I am also passionate about, and it's called CoCoRaHS. Stands for Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, and it is one of the biggest citizen science programs nationwide and even internationally. So, Elliot, if you can go to the next slide. First, we're just going to kind of briefly talk about citizen science. So citizen science is the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research to increase that scientific knowledge. And so that comes with having people participate in these programs by contributing, valuable data. In this instance, it's precipitation data on a large scale, often in areas where we don't have observations, and it will help increase our understanding of the science and make informed decision making. So, there's a lot of value in CoCoRaHS. But before CoCoRaHS, there is another program I want to briefly touch on. Go ahead to the next slide, Elliot. And that is the National Weather Service's Cooperative Weather Program. So this particular program is truly like the nation's weather and climate observing network. There are more than 8,000 volunteers that take daily observations of temperature and precipitation at their locations. And these could be on farms, in urban areas, suburban areas, national parks, from the seashores all the way up to the mountains. This data is truly representative of where people live and work. The co-op program was formally created under the Organic Act in 1890, and its mission is twofold, and that's to provide the observational data with this, like I said, the daily maximum minimum temperatures. It's also snowfall and precipitation totals, and to do real-time support for the National Weather Service programs, and that comes in the support of forecast verification and also warning verification. Can you go to the next slide? So again, CoCoRaHS, with the funny acronym, Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, is a nonprofit organization that is community-based. It's a network of volunteers who measure and report the rain, hail, and the snow from their backyards. You can go to the next slide, Elliot. So I'm going to give you a little bit of brief background about CoCoRaHS. It originally started as the Colorado Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, and it was the response to a devastating flash flood that hit Fort Collins at the end of July of 1997. So a very localized thunderstorm dumped over a foot of rain in several hours in the foothills of the mountains just to the west of the Fort Collins area, whereas other portions of the city only received anywhere from like 2 to 3 inches. Now this is Colorado. It's typically that's a month's worth of rain for them in some locations, and even a year's worth of rain in others. So the water just came through the town, and especially hardest hit was Colorado State University, where they lost. You can see one of the pictures there. That's their book archive from the university library. They lost all these books. There was almost $200 million worth of damages for this flood. Unfortunately, 5 people lost their lives. And so this program came out of that, and it was meant to help do a better job of mapping and reporting these intense storms. Next slide. So I want to just kind of give you an idea of what the footprint was. So in 1998 is when CoCoRaHS got its start. And it was basically going door to door, doing bucket surveys, finding people who were interested in taking extra precipitation measurements. So in 2002, this is a snapshot. You can just kind of see a little bit of those dots hanging around, the northern part of Colorado. If you go to the next slide, you can actually see where the program is now. It is in all 50 states. It is in Canada, it's Hawaii, it's Puerto Rico, it's the Bahamas. There's been some talk about it, expanding it even more internationally. And that's because precipitation varies so much with topography, storm type, season, elevation, latitude. So it's really important to understand and get the data within those gaps. If you go to the next slide, you can kind of see the footprint across the Southeast Dews area. I picked a date from just the end of last week, just so you can kind of see the variety and the variability in the rainfall here across our Dews areas. So what you're seeing is some of that liquid precipitation. You're seeing some snow water equivalent from that melted snow from that snowstorm across the region. Next slide. The whole idea behind CoCoRaHS is to kind of illustrate that one point can make a difference. One precipitation value, which might seem completely out of the ordinary, can make a difference. And so this was taken from a paper that actually talked about the importance of CoCoRaHS in citizen science. And as you can see, I've circled right here, that is a 7.12 inch rainfall, and it's surrounded by all these other rainfall totals that are less than an inch. And they did talk to the observer. They were able to verify that was a true, an actual true measurement. It kind of really does illustrate where you can be standing on one side of the street and it raining, and on the opposite side of the street it isn't. So even in an area where there's multiple stations, having that dense network comes in real handy. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of the Southeast Dews, again, all of 50 states will participate in this program. Virginia was the first in the Dews area. They came on in October of 2005. And then between April of 2007 and May of 2008, the rest of our Dews states joined the program. So when you're looking at this, you're looking at some stations that are in our Dews area that have provided more than 15 years worth of data and over 5,000 additional observations of precipitation across our Dews area. Next slide. Now, I could go on and on about different examples of how CoCoRaHS has been beneficial across the Southeast. I'm going to just focus on just last year, because last year was, as we attended these webinars every month, it was filled with ups and downs when it comes to precipitation. So I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple of examples of how CoCoRaHS has really helped hydrologists, meteorologists, emergency managers just over the past year. Next slide. So we'll start off with January 2024, snow in Tennessee. What you're seeing there are actual snowfall measurements taken. This is the snowfall total between January 14th and 16th of last year. Anywhere that you see a yellow dot, that is representative of a station that had more than 7 inches or close to over 8 inches of snow. And I just kind of included this little blurb that you can see. You can click on any of these dots on the map that CoCoRaHS has, our interactive map, and get a wealth of information just by clicking a dot. You can get information on the observation time, how much actual liquid or snow water equivalent value they measured in their gauge, the snow depth, the new snowfall. But the one thing I really love about CoCoRaHS observers is their willingness to share more information through their comments and their notes. So for this particular observer in Davidson County, Tennessee, they actually talked about, that they used a plywood snowboard to do these measurements. So they weren't just going around and putting a ruler in different places in the yard. They were actually following the suggested way of measuring snowfall. Next slide. But sometimes, we live in the South. Snow is a very rare thing that happens here. And so, one observer kind of said, I'm new at measuring snow, so I'm learning from my mistakes. The melted value of my snow core is not available because I spilled some trying to transfer the melted snow to the inner tube. So, having some of these additional comments really helps kind of when we're looking at the quantitative data, the numbers that are being submitted by our observers, having that qualitative data, that those comments and notes can come in really handy. So next slide. So now I'm going to focus on the June heat wave that we had at the end of June. That was between the 24th and the 26th. Some people don't realize this, but CoCoRaHS, in addition to measuring the rain, hail, and snow, there are select observers that also measure evapotranspiration. So the evapotranspiration is the water that is evaporated from the ground back to the atmosphere, and that's both through the transpiration through leaves and plants, but also just the direct evaporation from the open water and the soil. So during this time period, maximum temperatures were in the upper 90s. I believe during this time period, multiple stations in Alabama had temperatures that were over 100 degrees. I believe Selma had 104, if I remember correctly. And there are 2 observers in Alabama that actually do this evaporation. So if you look at the far left column, these are the daily evaporation amounts for the 3 days from both of those stations. And if you add those totals up, they come anywhere between 1/2 an inch and 3/4 of an inch of evaporation in a 3-day period. There was also an observer who noted it's been over 2 weeks without rain. Temperatures are in the 90s and it's getting quite dry. Ponds are rapidly being depleted with or without livestock drinking. So again, there's more of that qualitative data to go with that quantitative data. Next slide. And then we had Hurricane Debbie, the beginning of August. The maximum rainfall total from Hurricane Debbie was here in South Carolina. It was taken by CoCoRaHS observers in Moncks Corner, which is in Berkeley County, of 22.02 inches. That particular observer left comments every day that I was able to go back and read and kind of verify their total when we were looking at doing our storm reports and our storm assessments. Anywhere that you see the red dots on this screen, that is indicative of any station that had more than, I believe it was 12 inches of rain. So you can kind of see the swath. The rain came over an extended period. We actually had prefrontal and pre-storm rain happen prior to Debbie. So across South Carolina and even portions of Georgia and Florida. And so that rain really did pile up and we had flooding issues. Some of the CoCoRaHS observers talked about the flood on roadways, the rivers coming up, wildlife being displaced because of the high rivers during that particular event. But the summer was really interesting because we went from here in the Southeast News, if you attended any of the webinars, you would hear that it was like a roller coaster ride. We went from really warm, dry temperatures to having, a tropical system, and then we dried out again. So if Ellie can go to the next slide, one of the other amazing features of CoCoRaHS program is condition monitoring. So this is measuring and kind of the conditions on the ground, doing like a quantitative check. How dry are you? How wet are you? So shortly after Debbie came through, I pulled these numbers, and this is actually CoCoRaHS observer from the North Carolina near Salisbury, And he basically said, since August 1st, we've had 6.3 inches of rain. That is nearly 2 times as much rain as we have on average for the whole month of August in the Piedmont of of North Carolina. And we still have 14 days to go in the month. So, there's a lot of different things he talks about in there. He talks about flooded areas. The farmers are doing well. Temperatures have been okay. Plants and wildlife seem to be thriving, although there's wet conditions. So if we go to the next slide, like I said, it was kind of, and we've talked about this whole feast or famine type of idea. So as we were coming out of the rainfall from Debbie, we were starting to see these drought conditions really start to encroach in, especially in portions of Alabama and Tennessee. You can see even in central Tennessee, there's a location just south of the Nashville area where D3 extreme drought was actually being reported. So if you go to the next slide, person in Fayetteville, Tennessee had reported a severe, I'm sorry, there we go, severely dry in their particular area. And basically, feast or famine on different sides of the mountain, finished the month of April with only 0.07 inches of rain. Seems often, seems as often, the radar showing approaching rain and then splitting as it was coming near them. Talked about all of the ponds and the springs drying up, ground cracking, and the pastures being non-existent in this particular area. So these condition monitoring reports that the CoCoRaHS observers provide can be helpful when looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor to help make sure that the designation that is on the U.S. Drought Monitor is reflective of what is actually happening on the ground. So as we were still continuing to dry out, our eyes turned back to the tropics. We ended up with Hurricane Helene at the end of September. The storm wrecked portions of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and especially hardest hit North Carolina with the rainfall. From the Weather Prediction Center's tropical analysis, rainfall analysis, maximum rain total from that particular event of 30.78 inches of rain, and that's in Busick, North Carolina. If you go to the next slide, I've just kind of zoomed in on the western portions of North Carolina, especially in and around the hardest hit areas. And the rainfall totals from those particular locations, from anywhere in the Asheville area up to Banner Elk, those rainfall totals, you can see anywhere in the red, that is going to be rainfall totals that were over 14 inches of rain, some of them even approaching 25 inches or up to 30 inches of rain that we had. Now, this one was a little bit harder to read the comments for, if you go to the next slide, but our observers did make comments. One observer talked about they had some rain prior to Helene. Another one talked about living in Black Mountain that was devastated, and their home was destroyed by falling trees, and they had to evacuate. And so, made a comment in there. It's going to be a while before I can report to her again. Another observer in Banner Elk talked about their rain gauge being swept away, but they were able to take a look at the rain gauge and get some data before that happened. So, sometimes these comments that we see from our observers can be very helpful, but they are also reminders that, they're volunteers, they're people, and they can also be impacted by these particular events. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is going to be the last example that I'm going to kind of show just to illustrate the importance of CoCoRaHS. So this was from Hurricane Milton in October. Maximum rainfall over 20 inches in the St. Petersburg area. Again, the comments that the observers leave can be very instrumental. This one was not sure about the accuracy because I realized the top had blown off of my rain gauge, and I'm pretty sure some of it spilled from the main tube. And that the weather was too bad for them to go out and fix. That was one of the things that we always focus with our CoCoRaHS observers, is that their safety comes first. We'd love to get their observations, but they have to stay safe first. And just mentioning that they had lost power and that finally the rain had subsided by, the morning. So I'm going to close out with just a couple more slides. This next slide is one of my favorites. I've been the CoCoRaHS coordinator here in South Carolina since 2018. Prior to that, I was the CoCoRaHS coordinator in Florida. And I've had the privilege to meet CoCoRaHS observers in both states. I've had the privilege to meet some of our National Weather Service cooperative observers and be with them when they receive some of the highest awards from the National Weather Service for their years of service. The one is a Family Heritage Award. The top left picture you see there, that's Mrs. J. Roy, who's unfortunately no longer with us. But her family has been reporting here in South Carolina since 1892, and her son now carries on that tradition since her passing. So, just some of the faces that we actually see, some of the people that we get to meet when we do this. It really is thanks to our observers, both for the co-op program and for CoCoRaHS, that we are able to track, the nation's climate and have such detailed records of it. So, next slide, you probably have some questions if this is the first time you're hearing about CoCoRaHS. The frequently asked question is, who can join CoCoRaHS? And the program really is made up of volunteers from all ages and backgrounds. When I was in Florida, I had a set of triplets in one county that would go out every morning. They started when they were 7, and so you can start them young. I had another observer who was over 100. He was still taking observations, loved to go out every morning and report. I've already given you some ideas of how useful the data can be and who uses it. Again, National Weather Service, emergency managers, utility companies, USDA, climatologists, US Drought Monitor. And what do I need to do to become an observer? So the next slide just outlines those 4 easy steps. The first one is to register online at the website you see, which is www.cocorahs.org. You're going to view some online training slideshows. That's one of the great things about CoCoRaHS. Over the years, we've developed PDF trainings, video trainings on how to measure everything from precipitation to snowfall to hail. Get a rain gauge. Everybody uses the same rain gauge. It's one of the neat things about the program is that we can compare the rainfall data to our National Weather Service cooperative observers because of the standardized equipment that we use. And then just start recording and reporting those observations. So it only takes those 4 easy steps. And my next to last slide, starting March 1st, we are doing our March recruitment campaign. We're calling it the Rain Gauge Rally of 2025. We're trying to see how many new volunteers our states can recruit. So if you're interested in South Carolina or you're interested in CoCoRaHS, you can sign up today. But if you are in South Carolina, I want you to wait until March the 1st before you sign up, because I want those extra signups to go towards my tally to hopefully win the coveted CoCoRaHS Cup back to South Carolina. And with that, I appreciate again the time and the opportunity to talk about CoCoRaHS. Thank you.
All right, my name's Elliot Wickham. I am the Southeast Dues Coordinator for NOAA's NIDIS, National Integrated Drought Information System. First off, I'd like to say thank you so much for our presenters today, Chris, Todd, Pam, and Melissa. Also, I'd like to just extend a congratulations to Todd on his retirement coming up. Him and I have talked offline, and he has some very exciting things to look forward to on the other side of February 28th. But thank you so much for all your help and service in the Southeast River Forecast System, or Forecast Center, excuse me, and being a partner and providing all the information that you do. So with that, if you guys have any questions, please, for our speakers, please enter them in the questions box. This webinar, the summary and the recording, feel free to share it with when the information goes out. We'll send that out most likely tomorrow with a webinar recording link, and then the key takeaways, and those will be on through email. Our next webinar in March will be March 25th, and it is Understanding NOAA's Monthly and Seasonal Climate Outlooks. So understanding kind of how some of those maps that Chris showed earlier on with the outlooks, how those are made and how those products come together. And with that, let's go. We'll take some questions. I'll ask the first one, and Melissa, this is for you. First question is, does the CoCoRaHS mascot have a name?
Okay, so there is not an official nationwide CoCoRaHS mascot, but here in South Carolina, we do have a mascot. His name is Wally, the water drop. It's a big raindrop costume that makes special appearances at school visits and community events. So if you do live in South Carolina, the biggest community event coming up is the Palmetto Sportsman's Classic at the end of March, and you could come and meet Wally there.
Great, thank you. Then another question is there a moving up of maximum rainfall records for these storms, like Helene, Milton, and others, such as like low, or I think what they're asking is, are we seeing more maximum rainfall records from these storms? However, the person that put this in, feel free to add to that question if I'm not asking that correctly.
So, I can speak to the fact that we have more observers is allowing us to observe rainfall better. So if we go back and we look at, past storms prior to here in the Southeast, prior to about probably 2007, because that's when CoCoRaHS really took off. There's still pretty high, rainfall totals that are coming from those events. I mean, the highest tropical, let's go with the record 24-hour rainfall here in South Carolina is from September of 1999, which was Floyd, and that was 14.8 inches, and that was from the Myrtle Beach area. But now that we have all these additional observers, sometimes you can get those intense bands of rain that set up in a tropical system where we may have not had measurements before, but now we have someone that can monitor those. The Weather Prediction Center has an amazing website that goes back to 1956, and Dr. David Roth has done a lot of analysis on heavy precipitation from these events, and he's gone and combed through all of the co-op data that's available, and then more recently the co-op and the CoCoRaHS data to put together these maps where he's analyzed and scrutinized and quality controlled all of the data. So the maximum rainfall totals I mentioned for those storms in my presentation actually came from him doing that analysis.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you, Melissa, although maybe Pam is willing to speak up to this too. Are there many urban CoCoRaHS volunteers, especially in Georgia?
Yeah, I'll address that. We do have a lot. There's a lot more observers in Atlanta and in Athens, where we have an atmospheric sciences program, than there are in other parts of the state. We would dearly love to have more observers everywhere because urban rain is very highly variable. But we especially need observers in the southern part of the state because a lot of those rural counties don't have any observers at all. And I've been trying to convince our extension agents they ought to at least do it with some limited success. So anywhere in Georgia, we would welcome you to sign up. You don't even have to wait for March 1 because we're not going to be in competition anyway with Melissa. So I would say if you're interested, contact me or go to the website and learn more about it.
So, and I can speak for South Carolina. I mean, we have a lot of our denser networks for CoCoRaHS are in the urban areas. So we see them in Myrtle Beach, Charleston, Columbia, the Aiken Augusta area, Greenville, and even up around the Charlotte metro area. And we still want more observers in those areas. Like Pam said, urban rainfall is really important, but we're also looking to fill those gaps in. So in those rural areas, there's portions of South Carolina and counties in South Carolina where I have either one observer or no observer. And so being able to have someone in that county that can help report the precipitation, I really, if somebody wants to sign up today, I'll take the sign up, but I do want to bring that cup back.
All right. I do not see any more questions in the chat, but we still have time if people want to add some. Oh, here we go. One question is I think is CoCoRaHS an individual or a group type, like measurement that's put in. So like the example here is like a homeschooling group compared to, like a single family home or.
Oh, I can speak for this. So I know in South Carolina, I have a couple of the water management districts that are doing it at their headquarters. So, it's there's a couple of different volunteers that are part of those water management districts that are water districts that are going through and taking those observations. I have a couple of homeschool groups that are using it for their math and science standards. The one picture I showed with the mascot, that is a second grade school. They've got a CoCoRaHS gauge at the school, and so they kind of rotate through what classes measure. So it can be an individual project. It can be something that someone just puts up in their backyard, their mail, like near their mailbox, to take it. But if you're interested in using it for homeschool purposes, you're using it for your organization, or even in the classroom, we welcome. That's a great thing about this program. It can be easily tailored for one person to put the observations in, or an organization to do so.
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is it's tied to a specific location. So that could be somebody's house, but it could also be a school or a retirement home or something like that. You can have multiple observers at the same site, but because we have to put it on a map, we need to know what the location is. So you should have a separate observation for each location.
Great. And I'll throw this out there, and that we can talk about it, but it's not necessarily a question. Just someone put in a suggestion that many fire services and prescribed fire folks are already weather bugs, and that they might be an easy group to represent and get recruitment from. So I don't know if that's groups that you guys have been in contact with, but I agree that if they're willing to be involved, they're definitely good partners to discuss with. And so as of right now, I think we've gotten through all the questions. So again, thank you so much for all our presenters today. Again, Todd, thank you so much for all your service, and Shelby, we welcome you aboard. If anyone has any follow-up questions that they'd like to ask, feel free to send them to me at elliot.wickham@noaa.gov. Thank you again to our presenters, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their February and into March, and we'll see you at the end of March. Thank you.